If you walked into Margaret's house that winter, you'd think she was fine. Tidy rooms, warm light, fresh tea always steeping, but when the door closed, silence swallowed everything, and the truth settled like dust on the untouched dining table. 3 years a widow, Margaret, 72, had mastered the art of appearing busy while feeling invisible. Her days blurred together, stitched only by memories and the ache of being forgotten. Her neighbors waved kindly, but none knocked anymore. The mailbox brought more charity ads than letters. She kept her late husband's coat hanging by the door, still catching his scent, still whispering to it sometimes. She wasn't waiting for anyone. She'd stopped believing in visits, in surprises, in new chapters. Every Wednesday, Margaret drove to the animal shelter, not to adopt, just to be near something alive. She told herself she went for the knitting group that met nearby, but she never actually stayed. The barking behind those fences was chaotic, but honest, and somehow comforting. That's when she first saw him, a dog with ribs like fence posts and a cough that sounded like defeat. He didn't bark, didn't move, just stared through the bars like he'd already given up. A faded sign read, "Rusty, 11 years, terminal condition, not recommended for adoption." It felt like looking into a mirror. Rusty had been brought in by animal control, abandoned in a snowstorm, his body too frail to run, too stubborn to die. Most people walked past his cage without a second glance. Margaret didn't. She crouched down, met his tired eyes, and whispered, "I know." For 3 days she returned, each time staying longer. The shelter staff warned her gently. Rusty wouldn't last long, and he might not survive another winter. But Margaret felt something shifting inside her, something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose. He was sick, yes, but she could offer him warmth, a place to rest, to be loved in the end. At home, she cleared the guest room, filled a basket with blankets, and waited. The next morning, with trembling hands, she signed the paperwork. "Are you sure?" the clerk asked. Margaret nodded, tears welling. "I'm not saving him. We'll just keep each other company." Rusty didn't resist the leash. He walked beside her like he already knew where they were going. In the car, he laid his head on her knee, wheezing gently. She whispered stories to him during the drive, about her garden, about Harold, about the lonely winters. He didn't move, but she felt he was listening. Back at the house, Rusty stood at the doorway for a long time, as if unsure he was allowed to enter. Margaret waited, heart wider. Finally, he stepped inside, cautious, slow, but willing. That single step was the beginning of everything. That night, Margaret lay awake on the couch, watching Rusty sleep on his pile of blankets. His breathing was uneven, his body still shaking from cold memories. But when she reached out to adjust his blanket, he licked her wrist, once, gently, and she began to cry. The next morning, Rusty wouldn't eat. He sniffed the bowl, coughed once, then curled into himself. Margaret tried chicken broth, hand-feeding, soft-spoken encouragement, but nothing worked. A wave of fear rushed in. Had she brought him home just to watch him die? She called the vet, who had already reviewed Rusty's file. "Don't expect a turnaround," he said gently. "Just comfort." The word cut deep. Comfort was what she'd offered her husband in hospice. 2. Margaret hung up with trembling hands and sat beside Rusty, silent. Days passed in a fragile rhythm. Rusty would lift his head when Margaret entered the room, but barely moved otherwise. She read aloud to him, played old Sinatra records, left windows open for sunbeams to find his fur. Every tiny response felt like a lifeline. One evening, while brushing Rusty's patchy coat, Margaret found a deep sore on his side. Panic surged. Had she missed something serious? She rushed him back to the vet, who confirmed it. Infection. Treatable, but painful. "He's in bad shape," the vet said. "You sure about all this?" She nodded without hesitation. "He doesn't need to get better. He just needs not to feel alone." The vet gave her antibiotics and a warning. "If he goes downhill, he'll go fast." Driving home, Margaret spoke out loud to Rusty, promising him one thing: he'd never be left again. Neighbors started noticing. Margaret's lights stayed on later. Packages arrived with pet supplies. Some whispered behind curtains, "Why an old dying dog?" Others asked to help, but she refused politely. Rusty wasn't a project. He was family. One cold morning, Margaret woke up to find Rusty standing at her bedroom door, his legs shaky, but he'd made the effort. She gasped, then smiled wide, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Well, look at you," she whispered. "Look at you trying." But even as tiny improvements appeared, setbacks followed. Some nights he coughed so hard she thought he'd stop breathing. She'd sit beside him for hours, stroking his back, whispering calming words. Each breath he took felt like a decision to stay. One night, after a particularly hard coughing fit, Margaret found herself praying. Not for Rusty to live, but for him to feel safe, just once. She held his frail body against her chest and cried, remembering the exact shape of her husband's hand in his final moments. That night changed everything. As the wind howled outside, Margaret looked at the creature in her arms and made a quiet vow. She wasn't going to let him fade into the background like she had. Rusty deserved more than comfort. He deserved a reason to live. The next morning, something was different. Margaret woke to the sound of nails clicking softly on the hardwood floor. Rusty, walking. Not limping, walking. He reached her side and nudged her hand with his nose. Her breath caught. It was the first time he'd initiated touch. She rushed to make breakfast, this time adding a bit of scrambled egg to his dish. Rusty sniffed, then, slowly, surely, began to eat. Not much, but enough. Margaret stood there, hands trembling, heart racing. He was choosing life, one bite at a time. Day by day, they found a rhythm. She sang while she cleaned, and Rusty followed her from room to room like a tired shadow. He still slept off him, but now he sought her lap instead of his blanket. Each time he curled into her, she felt her own pain soften. Margaret posted a photo online. Rusty resting in her lap, his gray muzzle nestled in her arm. The post quietly spread. A retired nurse messaged her, offering ointments. A young man from the shelter dropped off supplements. "He's not invisible anymore," someone commented. Then came the letter. A local elementary school had read about Rusty and sent drawings. Shaky crayon hearts, a dog with angel wings, a note that read, "Dear Rusty, keep going. You matter." Margaret read each one aloud, her voice breaking on every word. One afternoon, the vet called after reviewing Rusty's latest results. "He's stable," he said, surprised. "Not cured, but healing." Margaret didn't speak at first. Her hands covered her mouth as tears poured down. Rusty sat beside her, pressing his body against her leg. Even her son, who hadn't visited in years, came by to meet the miracle mutt, as he joked. He brought soup, fixed a broken step, and stayed for dinner. Watching him scratch Rusty behind the ears, Margaret felt something unfamiliar, a flicker of reconnection. Outside, spring pushed through the last of winter. Daffodils poked up from the earth. Rusty barked once, loud and clear, at a squirrel. Margaret laughed so hard she cried. It was the first time the house had echoed with laughter in a long, long time. At a follow-up visit, a child in the waiting room asked if she could pet Rusty. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. Rusty, once terrified of touch, sat calmly as the little girl stroked his head. The mother whispered, "She just lost her dog. This means a lot." Margaret swallowed hard. That night, Rusty climbed onto Margaret's lap without help. His breathing was easier, his eyes softer. Margaret whispered, "You brought me back to life too." He blinked slowly, resting his head against her chest. Two old souls, healing each other, heartbeat by heartbeat. Margaret's home looked different now, not just tidier, but fuller. A food bowl always waited near the stove. A leash hung by the door, and Rusty's bed had migrated closer to hers. Morning walks became part of the ritual, slow but steady, with neighbors waving and sometimes joining. Rusty still had bad days, but they were outnumbered now. On good ones, he'd bring Margaret one of her slippers. Never both, just one, and sit proudly, tail thumping. She'd laugh, pretending to scold him, and give him a treat. Those tiny moments stitched a new kind of joy into her life. In town, they became a pair people noticed. At the pharmacy, the clerk saved Rusty a biscuit behind the counter. At the park, a bench was unofficially. A plaque was eventually added, for anyone who needed one more chance. Margaret never asked who did it. She started volunteering at the shelter once a week, reading to the dogs with the same calm voice she used for Rusty. Some volunteers called her the dog whisperer, but she just smiled. "They just want to be seen," she'd say, handing out blankets and kindness. Rusty's story spread slowly, a local newspaper, then an online blog. Donations to the shelter increased. 3 old dogs were adopted in a week. One volunteer said, "People just needed proof that love is worth the time, even at the end." Margaret nodded, knowing exactly what he meant. Her son began visiting monthly. Sometimes he brought his own kids, and they'd sit in the living room, giggling while Rusty tried to sit on all of them at once. Margaret watched it all like someone watching spring bloom in a field they thought was barren. One evening, while brushing Rusty's now glossy coat, Margaret whispered, "You were supposed to die here." She paused. "But instead, you made this home alive again." Rusty looked up, and in that stillness, something unspoken passed between them. Mutual rescue. Years later, when Rusty finally passed, he did so in Margaret's arms, under the daffodil sun. No cages, no fear, just love and peace. The vet said it was the most gentle goodbye he'd ever witnessed. Margaret held his paw and said thank you, over and over. She kept volunteering. She started a small fund in Rusty's name for senior dogs needing hospice homes. The tagline was simple: "They're not too old to matter." Every time someone adopted an overlooked animal, she felt Rusty's presence, not as memory, but as motion forward. In the end, Margaret didn't just give a dog a place to die. She gave him a reason to live, and in doing so, she found one too. He didn't just save a dog, he found himself in the love he gave.